Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this AJAC webinar conversation. My name is Laura Knapp. I am the Community Outreach Coordinator for Resource Basket and also today's Zoom technical support person. I am so thrilled you're all here to learn about AJAC. Virtually with me are Joy Millett, Kimberly Martis, and Eva Gregg. We have some outstanding presenters here with us today. Amy Gorn, Helen Atkenmuller, and Michael Jeffrey. Thank you all for joining us. Is everyone familiar and comfortable with the Zoom features? Just a quick refresher course. If you want to speak, just go ahead and click on the microphone icon to mute or unmute yourself. The chat box is available below to everyone who wish to send along a question or comments or both to anyone. You can send along to our presenters, really anyone. We welcome this open discussion. So I just want to let everyone know that this webinar is being recorded. And if you ever want to refer back to this AJAC conversation, we'll provide the video YouTube link privately via email and also on our website, hopefully by tomorrow, if not next week. So yeah, thank you everyone. I'm very pleased to welcome, first off, Amy Gorn. I'm just gonna read a little bit about her. Amy Gorn was appointed to the Alaska Juvenile Justice Advisory Committee back in 2016. She is currently AJAC's chair and previously served as vice chair. She is also a program officer for the Healthy Families Focus Area at the Mat-Su Health Foundation based in Wasilla. Previously, she worked at the Nome Youth Facility and for Rural CAP with the Resource Basket. Amy is passionate that Alaskans' children are well cared for, protected, and thriving. She has worked to strengthen prevention, health promotion, restorative justice, and positive youth development in Alaska. She brings this passion to her service on AJAC as the community advises the advisory, the Division of Juvenile Justice on its compliance of mandates within the Juvenile Justice Delinquency and Prevention Act. Welcome, Amy. And I'm going to have Eva talk a little bit about, just introduce Ellen and Mike. So go ahead, Eva.
Good morning. So, Ellen is a program coordinator for the Division of Juvenile Justice, and she is responsible for the management of Title II federal formula grant, including program and compliance requirements. She served as the DJJ staff liaison, oh my goodness, for the Alaska Juvenile Justice Advisory Committee, AJAC. She has managed multiple federal grant programs for 6 years and enjoys working with local Alaska experts and community agencies to improve programs and services for Alaska's youth. And Superior Court Judge Michael I. Jeffrey is a 43-year resident of Utqiagvik, the furthest north community in the United States. He moved there in 1977 for almost 5 years, after almost 5 years in North India, to open a legal services office serving low-income individuals with no criminal legal issues. The legislature established a Superior Court judge position in Utqiagvik in 1982, and Governor Jay Hammond appointed Judge Jeffrey as the first Superior Court judge. He served 32 years before retiring in December 2014 at the age of 70, as required by Alaska's Constitution. He dealt with felony crime, domestic violence, domestic relations cases, probate, juvenile delinquency, and child welfare. He served on many court committees, including the Judicial Education, and he was appointed to the AJJAC committee in 2010. He has served several terms up to the present moment. He became energized about the potential of tragedy of persons with fetal alcohol syndrome spectrum disorder, condition due to the exposure to alcohol in the womb. When they interact with government systems such as the justice system, he adjusts his courtroom behavior and certain court documents to attempt necessary accommodations. After intensive self-study, including numerous conferences, he has presented widely this issue and has written several published articles and other publications. He serves on the board of the Alaska Center for ASD, and it is its liaison between the National Affiliates Council of NOAFS. He and his wife, Esther, a Utqiagvik school nurse, have 3 adult children. Judge Jeffrey and Esther remain in the family home in Utqiagvik with Rondo, their dog. Whenever possible, the family continues to engage in commercial salmon fishing during the summer salmon run on the Bristol Bay coast. He enjoys singing, and this part I knew. He's a drummer in the traditional Eskimo dance group and is the active Rotary there. His post-secondary education includes degrees from Stanford University and Yale Law School. I knew you were a drummer. I recognize you.
Wow, thank you, Eva, and welcome, Amy, Michael, and Ellen. Since we're in the introductory mode, let's just go ahead and begin with a nice open introduction of fellow participants who are here. I think currently we have one person. So if you could please introduce yourself, your name, where you're from, and so forth.
Yeah, my name is Gunnar Kaiser. I'm here in Ketchikan, and I work for Ketchikan Indian community as an education specialist. I'm born and raised here in Ketchikan. I spent some time up in Fairbanks for about 10 years up in Fairbanks, but came back down and yeah, working with the youth and building youth programs for Native students here in Ketchikan. I'm excited to be here.
Yes, we are all excited too. Thank you, Gunnar, and welcome to this AJJAC talk. So at this time, I am going to hand this invisible mic off to Kimberly, as she will be diving deeper, basically explaining the purpose for this webinar, followed by Amy and Ellen's spiel on AJJAC and DJJ. And then we'll just later conclude the session with further questions, comments, and other personal reflections regarding the items being presented. And yeah, so Kimberly, it's all yours now.
Thank you, Laura. Appreciate it. It's really nice to just kind of get a little bit more familiar with all of the backgrounds. My background personally is I'm a California Indian. I'm Cupino in Tongva. I moved up here in 1977 after I was living in Olympia, attending college at Evergreen State College. And I had a really great opportunity to be in Native American Studies and get my degree in that. I met my late husband at college, and he brought me to Alaska. I am now a mother of grown kids, adult kids, and also I have 4 grandchildren now. So it's been really a pleasure to move through parenting to being a grandparent now. Many benefits there. I currently work at Rural Cap in the resource basket, which you might know is, I'm sure Amy knows, but basically we are the designated training and technical assistance providers. And we work with tribes in rural Alaska or throughout Alaska that have been receiving funds from Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention, OJJDP, and I just call them JJ because it's such a mouthful, but that's the federal part of the Department of Justice that is responsible for administering juvenile justice on the federal level. And Rural Cap and Resource Basket was formed about 6 years ago, I believe. Correct me, anybody correct me if I'm wrong, because I've only been here a couple years now. But my background is around, has been around advocating for children as a guardian ad litem in tribal court and in state court. And so, and representing tribes in ICWA cases in state court. And so kind of really focused on juveniles and tribal youth at this time. The connection between children and youth that have been victims of child abuse is really strongly connected to juvenile offenders who move from being victims to being offenders. And so that connection is really and inspired me to try to keep up with these type of problems. And so I specialize because I have a law background. I'm a graduate of University of New Mexico School of Law, a long time, 1993 now. And ever since, I have been dedicated to child advocacy, and really my passion has been development of tribal courts. And so been involved with Barrow, was one of the original, I guess, consultants or helpers with a team of people to actually develop their children's code, and then was honored and sworn in as a judge off and on for about 6 years. And then, so my passion is developing the capacities of tribal justice systems, particularly as it relates to children and youth, and using the tools of sovereignty and self-determination for tribes to take control of their children and develop out the healing and other resources, including Western resources, Western model resources, and apply that to the problems of Native families and children and youth. And that's me. I currently specialize or work closely with tribal healing to wellness courts, the therapeutic courts. Most of my grantees that I work closely with are in the process of establishing therapeutic court and process for youth. So it's right now the growth has been developing juvenile therapeutic courts. And it's a really big lift, because it's not just a regular court that you're designing, but you're doing the really difficult work of combining and teaming with mental health, behavioral health, and treatment services. And so that's, you know, where Alaska is severely undersourced for treatment. And so what seems to be really growing is the role of paraprofessionals, like cultural bearers and healers in the communities, who may not have all the full-fledged degrees in licensing, you know, the Western system, but who are in fact becoming the backbone of this restorative justice type principles in a culturally appropriate way. And so this is the this is sort of the area of work that I'm doing at Rural Cap. And on the flip side, I'm also just added some responsibilities because we were awarded another grant from Bureau of Justice Assistance that is basically to support development of tribal courts throughout rural Alaska for adults, juveniles, and whatnot. So we're in the process of doing a website, which will be hopefully up in the fall for tribal courts and tribes in rural Alaska to have more services. And so, so that's my role right now at Rural Cap. I just actually was working at Tlingit and Haida. I relocated from Juneau myself to come back to Anchorage to be with grandkids. And I was a tribal court administrator there, helping to establish tribal courts in the at the local village and tribal levels. And I had an opportunity to work with one of the finest tribal courts Tlingit and Haida operates in Southeast Alaska. So at any rate, a little background about kind of what preceded before this meeting was that the Office of Juvenile Justice, JJ, held a consultation which is now required under the new Juvenile Justice Reform Act. And so I think we worked with DJJ a little bit, or maybe invited you, but we had a webinar on the new requirements of the Reform Act. And it's a really a great tool that just expanded for tribes to have input and a voice regarding policy in the juvenile justice system and support for them developing their own justice systems. And so that was completed and really well attended by the grantees that we serve. And it really kind of sparked the idea that we should have a continuing dialogue, if we can, with DJJ, and that we would facilitate in our role as conveners of dialogue and conversations, because it's there's a lot of new tools that tribes need to be aware of, number one, and number two, the one of the goals I think we started out with was advertising the new tribal rep position that would be on the AJJAC. And so we're kind of looking at how we might continue these conversations and hopefully have more like grantees and people in rural Alaska, you know, that are participating. And so at any rate, it would be really helpful to be familiar. When I'm working with tribes on the local level, it's my duty to provide resources, and this may become one of the funding opportunities under the Reform Act, may be really, really helpful for tribes, because it's a really, juvenile justice is very underfunded in rural Alaska compared to like ICWA. And so anyways, I was just kind of hoping to have a conversation so that we as communicators and technical assistants can keep everybody informed who we work with in rural Alaska. Because sometimes the like applying for funding is a gap, you know, that a lot of people don't know how to, they don't know when to, they don't know what for, you know, and you have basically the grant writing and so forth is done by people that are pretty much learning on the job. And so they don't have that really strong expertise as a grant writer, you know, professional grant writer. They have 100 jobs that they do in addition to grant writing. So we wanted to be kind of a conduit going forward with DJJ, and how we wanted to support conversation, getting input, because there's some really powerful tools and opportunities that are becoming available, and we want to keep ourselves informed so that we can do our job of distributing, you know, letting the communities know about these resources and encouraging conversation about the needs, the priorities, and the cultural innovations, particularly that are growing out in rural Alaska. So that was kind of the background and the purpose a little bit about the of this webinar. Maybe we can look like, I would love, just to throw out an idea here, I would love if Mike, if you might be able to do a webinar for us, because we're really virtual. We're going virtual like right now. We can't, all of our site visits that I had planned, 6 of them at least, were canceled. And so we're really building up our distance capacity really fast. So I think it would be really nice to feature a series that, you know, maybe just with DJJ and just keep the information flowing, because it's really critical at this time that we're so limited with working from home and the impact of the COVID. So anyways, hopefully we can, this will be the beginning and not the end of, you know, this kind of conversation. So we're interested to hear from DJJ, and I had listed in the talking points, I kind of put Amy and Ellen together because it seems like, you know, it seems like a shared, you know, DJJ and AJJAC, you know, are kind of separate, but, you know, we wanted to get kind of the big picture of that. So at this time, should I hand it over to Ellen or Amy to just begin to talk about the purpose of the AJJAC? And then we can go a little bit deeper, you know, into questions or issues regarding how DJJ and AJJAC will be working together to plan for these new requirements and opportunities that is under the Juvenile Reform Act. So whichever one wants to go ahead and talk to us about AJJAC, and then Laura has some links on a links page we'll be providing that that show the website of DJJ, but particularly AJJAC, and the last annual report I think we have online. So, whoops. Huh. Okay. My computer just is acting up. So I'll go ahead and hand it off. Uh-oh.
I'll start out because I know inevitably I'll be turning it over to Ellen to provide a more robust description or information. So this is Amy Gorn. I want to just first say thank you and give my appreciation for the invitation to be a part of this webinar today. It means a lot to be able to join in with you. And I really appreciate the time that Ellen and Mike are also giving towards this today. And I will also definitely want us to be sure to hear from Mike. He precedes both Ellen and I in terms of his experience and involvement with the Alaska Juvenile Justice Advisory Committee. And so I also want to say that it's been really wonderful to catch up with the efforts and direction of the resource basket. I think that's very beneficial from my AJJAC perspective to hear the work that you're currently engaged with and growing. It's one very exciting to hear, and I'd love to consider in the future how the full committee of AJJAC could hear more about the efforts of the resource basket and our tribal grantees in Alaska. So this has been definitely, hopefully will be mutually beneficial today. So there is a statewide advisory group in each state, and that has come through as a requirement of the Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention Act. That was first, well, it was amended in 1974, and that's when SAGs, that they're called, were included. And so the Alaska Juvenile Justice Advisory Committee serves as Alaska's SAG for the compliance of receiving funding, Title II funding from AJJDP for the Division of Juvenile Justice. So yes, Kimberly, you're absolutely correct that we are separate entities, DJJ, and then the advisory committee, which is of course appointed, and we can talk more about that through boards and commissions in the governor's office. But I would love to add that we have enjoyed a very close working relationship through, I would believe, all these years, at least since my time being appointed to the AJJAC. And so the purpose of AJJAC is that it is to affect change and be a catalyst in the prevention and reduction of juvenile delinquency in Alaska, much like the resource basket. And that is by operating this advisory board for planning, administrative and funding functions of the JJDP Act, as well as having overall responsibility to develop, approve, and implement the Juvenile Justice Plan in the state and advising the Division of Juvenile Justice around this plan so that we can strengthen and improve the system of juvenile justice in Alaska. So that is the official purpose. There are 4 core mandates with that funding that we follow for compliance, and we can speak more about that as well. We are a statewide representative body. So with the appointments that the governor's office makes, we represent currently from now Cake out to Bethel, up to Kotzebue, Utqiagvik, and other, some of the urban areas, especially Fairbanks, Mat-Su, and Anchorage. So we are a statewide body. We pretty much conduct our business quarterly over the telephone in public meetings in which the public is welcome to attend and have and make comments if they'd like. And we try to have an in-person meeting once a year. We do put out the annual report, as Kimberly, you noted. I don't believe our 2020 report is on the website and looking at it earlier, but I have a copy of it and we have a PDF, which we can certainly share. I'll just note a couple of the activities because that's easy stuff to talk about, and then would definitely love to hear from Ellen and Mike as well. I'm kind of riffing from your talking points, Kim, if that's okay. But in recent years, we added a few activities that I think are very enriching in terms of the purpose of AJJAC. One is there is a coalition of juvenile justice, and that is a national organization of which AJJAC is a member to. And they really help provide what are best practices, national trends, advocacy for funding at the national level for juvenile justice, and other very important information as all states work towards their supporting their young people and being in adherence to the Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention Act. So we learn from them, and there is an annual conference, and we've sent members to that for many years now. This year it's being held virtually and delayed until the fall when it's normally in the summer. We also have an opportunity to speak to the congressional delegation during that conference, which is usually held in DC. So Senators Murkowski, Sullivan, and Representative Young have been able to hear about juvenile justice through AJJAC for a number of years now and are very interested and supportive of hearing about that year to year. We also likewise have done that in Juneau. So the last couple of years, there have been a few members who have traveled to Juneau and worked the halls in the Capitol, setting up a day of appointments to meet with lawmakers to be able to share and educate about what is AJJAC, and they're very interested in the state of juvenile justice, like what is the status, how are we doing as a state on behalf of our young people. And we might have some talking points. One year, of course, we experienced, well, the Nome Youth Facility had been slated to be closed over budget considerations for a number of years. That was certainly something we discussed in Juneau. And then it has now since closed. So some of the impacts related to that and how the division has adjusted to that closure has come up in Juneau. Sometimes there's just some legislative language cleanup that is important to do, and we're able to speak about that. We don't advocate necessarily, we're educating, and it is certainly something that we do as a unified voice with the committee. It's not like I am stating my personal opinions on matters, it's on behalf of the committee. And sometimes we will poll the committee in terms of where we decide to put our stance on funding at a national level and so forth. So those were just some of the activities in which we try to be engaged and a presence. And I believe we've also been able to really speak to the value and approach that DJJ has in the state, because it really has been on the forefront of being trauma informed for our youth. Several years ago, DJJ worked on the diversion agreements that started with the interior tribes, which is something that I like to be able to tell lawmakers and others about. That number of those agreements has grown over the years, and that's really important. And we also, as a committee, love to understand the data. I know you have further on, Kimberly, about the racial and ethnic disproportionality data, and that is something that we are briefed on during our in-person meeting annually. And we note trends and we discuss them. One thing I'll mention just briefly is, you know, we are noticing nationally that the trends of referrals to the system are typically going down. Well, and Alaska has followed suit, but what we've also noticed is the severity of some of the crimes of which offenders have been referred for have increased, and then the needs, the multiple needs that come along with supporting those young people have placed a lot of, I don't want to say burden, but it has brought a lot to the division and how they respond to and take care of those young people. So mental health services, as you had indicated, Kimberly, has been discussed for a number of years, and has led to some funding that the division was able to apply for successfully and receive, and is beginning to implement. So we're considering those dynamics and what that means in terms of support that is needed to the division to meet those needs and continue to follow the trends. And hopefully, Mike, maybe later, in one of the many things you would probably be able to share is to talk about the focus groups, which is a key activity that I think many of us enjoy and find fulfilling through our service on AJJAC. So I just spoke about a whole variety of things, and I'm sure Ellen is able to provide a more thorough backdrop of what the AJJAC is, and anything else that I didn't cover well or missed entirely. So Ellen, would it be okay to turn to you at this time?
Absolutely. Thank you, Amy. I am just kind of thinking, you know, what might be beneficial to cover or highlight, because you did an incredibly thorough job at kind of outlining the history of AJJAC and where that legislation comes from with the requirement for the state advisory group, and then also just the relationship and the role of AJJAC and DJJ currently in the state. So I think that was a wonderful summary. And I'm not really identifying any areas with which to expand on that. So I would just like to echo, in addition to everything that Amy said, just the value that DJJ sees in working with the AJAC and all of the perspectives and the experience that our membership bring to the table in terms of helping the division identify and work through some of those trends in the data that we're seeing, the needs with the youth, and what is reported not only in the data, but from the youth themselves in the focus group, and then being able to take those recommendations from AJAC and not only incorporate them in the context of the federal Title II grant, but also look at what are larger systems initiatives that may need some attention or that may need a little more focus or could be a higher priority as well. And so we really value the recommendations and the insight that our AJAC members are able to give us.
So I'll take on before perhaps Judge Jeffrey will share with us is, I believe our membership now is at 20 members, and that is the largest committee we've had in a number of years. And what the reauthorization of the Juvenile Justice Delinquency Prevention Act included was specific representation types on the committee, and we have to meet those representations to be in compliance for the funding to the state. And so one of that does include a tribal representative, and we have just recently, as you might see on the screen here, Mike Jackson from CAIC has just recently been appointed, so recently that we haven't even touched base with him yet, but I greatly look forward to it because I think many of us on this call here know Mike, his reputation, and he is very supportive of restorative justice efforts in Alaska. So I am thrilled that he has been appointed. We have others such as elected officials, representation of victims, those who have experienced the system, and youth members, public members, and so forth. And so we are in compliance with all of those designations. However, I will put my plug in now while I can, that things happen. You never know if someone for circumstances need to step off and changes occur. And boards and commissions is always interested to have interested folks come to them so they can have a conversation and keep them in mind when openings do occur. And there is the boards and commissions page on the governor's website in which a person can apply online or inquire how to do that, how to engage in that application process, and to submit perhaps via email instead, because the online system is a bit interesting. Thanks, navigating the sheet, the page there. And so I think they always want to know who's interested in juvenile justice and would keep them in mind when the time is needed. So want to keep that recruitment possibility open for always. So Mike, I'm wondering if you would be able to share a bit about what your experience in serving with AJAC has been. I know I've been able to learn a great deal from you during my time, especially around FASD, and whatever else you'd like to share about AJAC and maybe including the focus groups.
Sure, thank you, Amy. Well, Amy and Ellen do such a great job of summarizing the whole thing that there's, in many ways, there's not much to add, but certainly my personal experience, that's mine. So, but you know, to be on the AJAC, you know, it's a governor-appointed group, and I remember one time there was a, this is years ago, and I think actually I've got to do some research. I think I was appointed before 2010. I got to look into that a little bit, but at one point, you know, there was a new party took over as the governor, and there was apparently some thought of cleaning house and make sure that everybody in the board was the same vibe as the governor. And one of the, I think he was the chair at the time, but he was of the same, you know, party as the new governor. And he said, don't do it. The idea of this group is a cross section of people, all who care about juvenile justice and youth. And it's part of its strength is just that there's all different kinds of people involved. And I think, you know, and so that you don't see, there's always, with the new governor, there can be some people that are removed because you are governor appointed. And so even though we have terms, if so inclined, the governor could step in to say, you're gone. No, that could happen and does, but not very much. And it's exciting to see this new list. I wasn't aware of the expansion, and I'm as thrilled as everybody else about having Mike Jackson on this. It's been fantastic. He's a star. But you know, the experience of being on the board, it's very important. But except for someone like Amy, who's the chair, and maybe the vice chair, for the rest of us, it's not a burden of time. I mean, we're all busy. And so, you know, the question is, gosh, can I take this on? Well, you can, because, you know, we have these quarterly meetings, which are an hour during the lunch hour usually. And then an in-person meeting, which is, you know, subject to funding, but the funding we get actually is not from the state. Our budget is 100% federal, and it's based on these grant funds, whatever the title is, Ellen can say, wherever they're from, but they're based on the population of a state, and so of course Alaska is at the minimum amount, but that's still enough for us to do business and also to have an in-person meeting. And we have had them in the past in various parts of the state. Especially memorable one was the one in Nome, where we could meet there and see the youth facility as a group. And there was a couple of us that actually, there was one of the juvenile justice officers was going out to a village, and we actually went also, which was amazing. Very often nowadays, you know, with so many groups, that we end up meeting in Anchorage because it's just the most cost effective. And so that's kind of been the routine recently. And so there's that. And then when we're doing the annual report, you know, on a committee and working with that. But other than that, it's a manageable commitment. I personally have never been to the meetings in Washington, D.C. of the Coalition for Juvenile Justice. There's always plenty of people wanting to make that trip. And so I've kind of stepped back and said, go ahead, I'm fine. You know? So in all the years I've been on there, I've never gone to that. But of course, I think many of us have been to conferences like that. But focus groups, as Amy said, really are a big draw and an amazing opportunity for those of us on this board, because part of the federal mandate for these state advisory groups like AJJAC, and federal mandate is that you will go into the juvenile justice facilities and talk to the youth in there about their experience. And, you know, especially as a sitting judge, that is never going to happen if it weren't in the context of AJJAC. I mean, and but we go in and we've developed over the years a set of questions that try to draw people out in a reasonable way. And they've been vetted by by DJJ people, and everybody agrees, yeah, these are good things to get into. And then, so what's the experience? Well, you show up at the front door of the facility, and we usually are divided into 2 or 3 person teams. And then, you know, you sit down and talk with the youth. And the facilities usually have a detention side and a longer term treatment side. And so it's kind of like you don't have time to do both. So you're in one side or the other. They both have their advantages. Going to talk to youth that have recently been detained, that's a reality, you know, and how's it going, you know, and so on. Talking to the people in on the long-term side, you can really get into, well, the kind of treatment resources. I mean, there are treatment resources even in detention, but in terms of the really deeper effort, they're on the long-term side. And so, you know, well, because we read about, talk about during the meetings, read about different initiatives that the division is making. And so the question is, well, how are they? You know, what's the story? Now, over the years, there have been improvements. I'm remembering, especially around the time that we met in Nome, there had been a report by some, and I guess it was funded by the state, but there were some experts in alcohol treatment that of youth that went in and took a look at what the division was offering at that time for alcohol treatment, which of course, as we all know, is a big deal. And they found it was inadequate. It was not what was needed. And because, especially when you think of the whole set of, you know, youth, and then youth with alcohol issues, and then youth with such alcohol issues that they get involved in the criminal or the juvenile justice system, and then end up in longer term treatment. I mean, that subset especially is likely to have some deeper problems. And if you, at the time, the kind of treatment that was being offered was the kind that would make sense for a very short-term interaction, maybe leading to future treatment and so on. So, you know, that was, so we echoed that, and we kind of pushed on that. And now there's much better alcohol drug treatment available to the youth. And I really think that the pressure from AJJAC has something to do with that. Amy mentioned the wonderful fact there's less youth involved in juvenile justice, great, but the very sad fact that there's some very serious cases. And when I was a judge, you know, I dealt with some of those, and I mean, murder and things like that. I mean, very serious cases. Well, it turns out that and this is something we talked about at one of our meetings, but it turns out that, you know, look, this is another thing. Those youth need a special kind of treatment. And so, and there's a program in Texas which specializes in working with this sort of juvenile offender. And the happiness, so we were supporting having additional resources for DJJ staff to work with this cohort of youth. And I'm very glad to say that is happening. In other words, they have reached out. In fact, that program in Texas, I think, is involved. And it's, in other words, the DJJ is behind it, is behind providing this resource. And it's just at the moment in the process, and Ellen may give us an update where that's at, but you know, there may be people traveling out to Texas, maybe, or maybe that was the plan. I don't know. But maybe there'd be a virtual training. I don't know. But I really, again, feel that the role that we had as a group, which has respect within DJJ, contributed to that initiative going forward. So maybe I'll just stop talking on stuff there, but I've really found it a very worthwhile thing to be on the AJJAC. But Ellen, where are we at with the that special training?
That's a great question. And I also think that that is such a good example of one of the different ways that DJJ works with AJJAC. So the state advisory group requirement is specific to the Title II formula grant. However, due to a variety of factors regarding our minimum allocation funding, like Mike said, and then the portion of those funds that are used to fulfill the grant requirements themselves, we don't always have a large amount of what we would call discretionary or flexible funding to look at these larger systems change initiatives. So in the situation that Mike is describing and referring to, this feedback, this is feedback that we had gotten from AJJAC about the need to look at specialized programming, to really look at specific interventions and treatment programs that target some of these serious high-level offenders, that really target specialized mental health needs. And that initiative is just not something that we had the level of funding available in the Title II grant. And so what we did as a division is we found a different grant opportunity to really dive into that project. And so we were able to approach AJJAC and ask for a letter of support, which they provided, saying, yes, we recognize this is a need. We were able to take those recommendations and feedback and incorporate them into that grant application. And we were awarded that grant in 2018. So with that specific project, just on a brief update, Mike, is you are absolutely right. We have been in communication with that particular treatment program in Texas to look at programming for serious violent offenders and bringing that back to Alaska. DJJ is undergoing some structural systems changes at the moment, and we are going to have a specialized violent offenders unit to really train staff in that particular training and treatment and intervention method. And so we'll have a specialized unit. And we were going to send a number of staff on site into Texas to work with that particular program and get training as the beginning steps to implement that here in Alaska. And that original site visit, I believe, was scheduled for April. And of course, due to COVID travel restrictions, that has not happened. So it will be being rescheduled when things are a little more when it's more realistic to take that kind of trip.
All right. So, I mean, looking at the time, very briefly, I mean, none of us have mentioned the 4 core mandates and what they are, which is actually the biz of these state advisory groups. And basically the way it works is you've got to be seen to be in compliance of working on these issues. And if you aren't, you are penalized with the grant and by a certain percentage, like 25% or something like that. And then that money, that 25%, has to be used 100% to get back in compliance with the mandates. Now, what are they? Well, I'll try. I mean, the one that was springing to mind that really was hard. Sight and sound separation. The youth, if they're in detention, they should not hear or see adult. Okay, fine. In Fairbanks, that can be arranged. in EEC, it could be a problem. And so, or, Nuixit or something like that. I mean, it could be a problem because why? Well, because you've only got the small station and so on. And so how do you deal with that? And so we struggled. There was a time when we had a bunch of violations. And now there's this elaborate system, which I don't think we have time to go into, but there's a contractor that's, I think, every day checking with places and who was in custody and all that kind of thing. But Ellen, just to make sure I don't leave anything out, why don't you very quickly mention the other three, and then, but I guess, yeah, and then, I'll just mention, obviously with my interest in fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, that is something that I would be looking into. Is the facility adapting to that condition? Are they slowing down, and so on and so on? And one thing I've been delighted to see over the years is an emphasis on individualizing the treatment that youth have. And, just almost automatically, that provides an opportunity to make these accommodations that are needed. But Ellen, what about the other three?
Yeah, great. That's a great thing to bring up, Mike. So one of the primary functions of applying for and executing the programming related to a Title II grant, and then also one of the primary functions of AJJAC, is to ensure that the state is in compliance with these various federal mandates. And so we have 4 of them, like Mike said, and he described the first one, which requires sight and sound separation of juvenile and adult offenders in facilities. And then we also have the requirement of deinstitutionalization of status offenders. And that is a long way to say that you should not be detaining youth securely for status offenses. So things that would not be an offense if you were an adult. And so that could be things like truancy, curfew violations, things like that. If you wouldn't be detained as an adult, you cannot securely detain a juvenile for that same offense. Minor consuming, all of those things. And so we also have the jail removal requirement, which really gets to the fact that juveniles should not be held securely in adult jails. Without getting too in the weeds on various exceptions and waivers in the state of Alaska, we do have a rural exception waiver just because due to the high number of local rural law enforcement facilities that we work with that are off the road system, that have significant distance and travel barriers to get that juvenile to our detention facilities. If needed, we do have some exceptions that we can operate with those rural facilities to allow for that detention pending transport to a juvenile facility if needed. And then the fourth mandate that the states are required to address and make progress with is regards to disproportionate minority contact. It actually was renamed as part of the reauthorization to reducing racial and ethnic disparities. And so as all of the programming gets fully transitioned, you'll often see both of those terms, disproportionate minority contact and reducing racial and ethnic disparities. And so those are the 4 mandates that Alaska is required to comply with and make progress on. There are different kind of reporting thresholds and requirements on each mandate. And so I'm happy to go more into detail on those if there's an interest, but I think maybe we could save that for a follow-up conversation if that warrants, just in terms of how actually calculating compliance rates and things like that. But as Mike mentioned, it's a serious challenge and a serious something that we take very seriously because our funding is tied to those compliance rates. And so if we are out of compliance with any of those 4 requirements, we do take a 20% reduction on our award, and then are obligated to, like Mike said, spend 50% of our award looking at getting back into compliance with that area. So not only do findings of non-compliance reduce your overall award, it also reduces the flexibility that you have with your funding to support other activities. So that's something that we do monitor very, very closely.
Okay.
DJJ really is tracking. I mean, again, we've been working on this for years. I don't know when, I mean, well, we've had to, but it was at the beginning very hard because, well, there weren't the statistics, they weren't gathering that. Well, now for some time now they have, and then we hear about that at our meetings, but it's very carefully tracked.
Hi, this is Kimberly, and I just wanted to acknowledge we have 15 more minutes.
Mhm.
And I was wondering if you could focus, maybe Ellen, on the funding going forward that would be available to tribes through the Juvenile Justice Reform Act. And I think Laura had pulled up the funding, the grantees that are currently receiving Title II funding. And I ask about it because it's one of the things we'd like to advertise. And is there a plan, so to speak, for the funding to comply with the Juvenile Justice Reform Act? Because it pretty much unlocks the door for tribes to contract or get grants from DJJ.
So I'm happy to talk about that. I think that is such an important topic. And Kimberly, just to make sure that I'm targeting the right information, are you referring to like the Native American pass-through funds that were discussed on the tribal consultation webinar?
Yeah. Uh-huh.
Okay. So there, I was grateful that I was able to participate in that tribal consultation webinar. Unfortunately, I think that some of the technicalities surrounding that rule were not necessarily framed in the most complete way. So I think this is a really timely conversation for us to have, particularly with Rural CAP, who has been such a strong partner to DJJ for so long. So that Native American pass-through funding requirement, that's not new, actually, under the reauthorization. That has been a part of the Title II grant and a part of the JJDP Act for, I believe, since its inception. And that's something that DJJ has been doing for a number of years. And so it's not necessarily that there's this new proportion of the funds that then are allocated to the tribes, because Alaska has already been doing that. One thing that is always an option to look at how those funds are utilized. So I'll speak with just from my experience kind of in the past 4 to 5 years of history. So what DJJ has done with those funds in the recent past is use Native American pass-through funds to support the youth development and culture grants, the sub-grants that are offered by Rural CAP, the pass-through money that we give to Rural CAP, and then you work with getting out to your local communities. And so we've done that with the Native American pass-through funds. And then most recently also, we have used those to support tribal diversion initiatives, working with local tribes on training with tribal courts, technical assistance in how to, with the rural diversion agreements that DJJ has, working with those communities to establish, really strengthen that partnership and make sure that those programs are, one, getting the support and to the referrals that they need. So in the past just handful of years, those are just two examples of how we have used those funds. And every state that has that requirement is a little different, right? And so there are some states that do have a larger grant application process where tribes individually apply for a variety of programs. There are other states that do similar things like Alaska has done in the past, where we say we're giving this money to Rural CAP, and then Rural CAP works with the local communities in supporting tribal programs or tribal initiatives. So each state is unique in how those funds are actually dispersed. And one way that Alaska decides in how to identify that programming and how to work with that particular money is through the input provided by AJJAC. And so at least in the last 4 years that I have worked with the group, focusing on rural programming, focusing on programs for Alaska Native youth, focusing on some of these tribal diversion agreements and that initiative statewide. From my perspective, as the board liaison, that has been loud and clear from AJJAC that is to remain a priority. And so if there were new ideas to how to change that structure, if there was a strong level of advocacy within the membership to, change that format to like a mini grant type of situation, that is absolutely a conversation that we're willing to have, because we really look at AJJAC for our recommendations in terms of programming and priorities and what should happen with those funds. So that was just one piece that when I sat in on that consultation, I felt like it was kind of marketed as this was brand new. And it didn't fully acknowledge that this is something that has been required. And I think it's always good to bring that to the forefront and to still highlight that opportunity and to keep those lines of communication open, that this is a requirement, it is built into the grant, but it's not actually new. And I feel like that distinction was not totally clear. Yeah.
I mean, and that's really helpful to know, because I know there's kind of like there's a backstory, like it's all, you know what I mean, our story in terms of how funding is distributed. But do you know what percentage is going to tribes from Title II, and also what the percentage of the overall budget and amount of tribes?
So that's a great question. So Alaska's award, it varies a little bit year to year because it's a calculation based at the national level. Alaska's award is typically around $400,000. It might vary by a couple hundred, maybe 2,000 year to year. So we get about $400,000, and then according to the federal formula that calculates Native American pass-through, the Native American pass-through requirement is typically around 34,000 and change. And so percentage-wise, I could pull up a calculator. I'm not sure the percentage off the top of my head, but the Native American pass-through requirement is around 34,000, and that's ultimately based on whatever our final total dollar of our award is. But the past several years have been giving approximately 125,000 to Rural CAP for the youth development and culture grants.
Yeah. And my colleague Eva is is really the key coordinator of that great initiative. Although I know it's challenged right now, culture camp are hard to do in the middle of the COVID. So
yeah.
But I guess the other thing is just I think it would be a good talking point to continue, because I think you could get a lot of justification, and a lot of, I mean, it's sort of like when you look at the outcomes of the investments that are made into tribes, it's pretty phenomenal since
Mhm.
there's nothing there. You know, in many villages, there's no DJJ office.
Mhm.
And plus the innovations that are coming out in terms of cultural healing are just a really, that's a deep root that could be supported. And I think what I hear from grantees who are able to, every now and then they get funding directly from, you know, OJJDP, which that's who we work with, is the grantees, is that they're really have replaced the state juvenile justice system, at least their courts, you know. And then there's gaps because there isn't probation, tribal probation, so to speak, developed. And so, so I guess what I'm getting at is any way that we can help to advocate, I think, on the tribal side, to really say, you know, here's results, you know what I mean? And critically, what I hear on the tribal side is that they're doing the state's job without any support, you know, which is kind of how tribal justice is altogether, you know. And so so I think one of the most important tools is that DJJ diversion agreement, right?
Mhm.
But without funding, you know, it's really hard or for or $8,000 or something,
Mhm.
like a minimal amount, doesn't fund, you know, we're in the court ghetto, so to speak. And so that would be a really important. And I think the fact that, you know, the disproportionality, like even though the trend is for less referrals and less juvenile offenders, you know, at this point, I am not sure what nationally for the Native youth that are incarcerated or under in custody of the juvenile justice systems. I don't think that, I'm not sure about that trend is what I'm saying. And my thinking is that the fact that the high number of Alaska Native youth and African American, other children of color, youth of color, should justify, you know, in some way, more investment into the communities and the treatments that are relevant, you know, and could be more effective, you know. And so that's kind of some thoughts about how do we get from here, you know, to increasing funding, because that's the considerations are that tribes have, that they think about and ponder before they actually get into juvenile justice, is for the most part off-putting because there's no funding, you know. And it's great what OJJDP provides, but that's seed money, and the sustainability type of skills are lacking, you know what I mean? And so so at any rate, I also think that a lot of the communities that we work with are interested in reentry, juvenile reentry, because and you know, in a broad sense, you know, because it's such a culture shock and on and on. First of all, having to come into a urban area, and then be at McLaughlin and so forth, and then returning, the support has to be organized. It has to be targeted, you know, otherwise it's recidivism, you know, those youth are going back. And so that's a really big problem that I see, is, and we're in our federal grant that we're getting renewed, we have featured juvenile reentry. And so that might be a really great point of collaboration. We're working closely with the Alaska Native Justice Center on their juvenile reentry, and we're getting ready to hold a hopefully in January, we're working to hold a reentry workshop for tribes, and that would be probably like February of 2021, depends on the depends on the COVID. But we're focused on juvenile reentry as well in that. 'Cause usually tribes have been focused on adult reentry, but it's time to shift. You know, I think people are feeling the need to shift towards juvenile reentry. And then I think intersectional issues have to do with law enforcement, you know, with
Hey,
community.
Kimberly.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, Kimberly, to interrupt, but we are approaching 11:30, and I want to respect people's time here. Thank you so much, Amy, Ellen, Mike, for sharing the history, the role and priorities of AJAC and its connection to DJJ. At this time, as we're approaching 11:30, if something pops up in the next week, or if Gunnar or any of us have questions or thoughts for any of you guys, please reach out to them. Yeah, so don't hesitate to email. One of them will be providing extra links on our resource basket. And so Joy, Eva, or Kimberly, would one of you mind sending us off with a closing prayer or any word of thanks to everyone?
I just want to thank deeply. Thank you for coming on and sharing your knowledge. I learned an incredible amount. And then I just really look forward with the new opportunities. And I'm pleased, so pleased that Mike Jackson is going to be added. And I just want to thank you, and maybe we can do this monthly, just to get it, because I mean, either way, involving grantees, participants, we could probably get more participation, number one. And number two, I think looking at, collaboration points, because we're already collaborating, already, but now in view of the new law, how can we strengthen, and have more of a united effort. So I want to thank you so much. It's a really, really great to have you.
Yes, we're just so fortunate and appreciative to have this partnership with AJAC, just like what Kimberly was saying. So thank you so much, everyone, and who joined us today. We'll have a recording available in the next few days, maybe tomorrow. And thank you, everyone. That concludes our AJAC webinar session.
It was great, you guys. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Michael.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.